Must and Master. Meher Baba's work with the God Intoxicated, 1939 to 1947. Although the ashram for the mad, begun at Rahuri in 1936, was an important precursor to Meher Baba's must work, the main focus of the must work itself took place between 1940 and 1946. There were musts, or God-intoxicated souls, in Meher Baba's life prior to 1940, and he continued to have contact with musts for much of the remainder of his life after 1946. However, the years of 1940 to 1946 mark a period of extraordinarily intensive and focused work on contacting musts. Technically, one could say that Meher Baba's must work began in 1936 with the arrival of Muhammad, one of the 5 favorites, at the Rahuri Mad Ashram. There were other musts at the Rahuri Mad Ashram, 4 to be precise, and Muhammad was not the first must that Meher Baba worked with. But Muhammad could easily be considered the most significant must at the Mad Ashram. Muhammad not only survived all other known musts contacted by Meher Baba, but he continued to live at Meherabad until his death on June 17, 2003, at the estimated age of 95. Our main thesis in this presentation is that, as mysterious as Meher Baba's work with the musts is, it affords us the most descriptive glimpse available of how Meher Baba understood his spiritual work in general. If we look at principles that are true of Meher Baba's work with the musts and take the liberty to generalize them to his work with other individuals and groups, we may discover that some similarities and insights emerge. In our video presentation last year on Meher Baba's Rahuri ashram, we discussed the difference between mad and must states, the nature of the mental state of musts, and exactly how these souls actually came to be musts. In this presentation, we will shift our focus to the nature of Meher Baba's work with musts, why he expended such extraordinary efforts to contact musts, and exactly what these contacts amounted to the extent that such mysteries can be discussed at all. We will draw primarily on Dr. William Donkin's classic treatise, The Wayfarers, as well as on field research and personal communications with witnesses to Meher Baba's work with musts. According to Dr. Donkin, during the period of 1939 to 1947, Baba established roughly 7 must ashrams, and he conducted numerous must tours of such a complex nature that it becomes difficult to fix a number of how many tours there actually were. As Donkin explains in his book, there is no hard and fast rule as to what exactly constituted a must ashram, nor, for that matter, what exactly constituted a must tour. For example, Donkin says that from the beginning of his work with Muhammad, quote, Baba arranged to have musts constantly close to him by making ashrams for them wherever he happened to be, and musts were brought to these ashrams by various disciples for his contact. End of quote. Of the 7 ashrams that Donkin lists, 5 of them were established during the years 1939 and 1940. There were no more must ashrams established thereafter until 1946 and 1947. Meher Baba was far from idle during the 6-year interim between must ashrams, 1940 through 1946 being his most intensive period of must tours. Donkin explains that the term must tour is something of a misnomer, because during these trips Baba engaged in other work as well, As Donkin explains, quote, "On these tours, although we have generally called them must tours, Baba actually contacts four classes of people. Firstly, musts of all type. Secondly, those with hawa, seekers and initiate, advanced and adept pilgrims, i.e. salik-like pilgrims of all grades. Thirdly, sadhus and fakirs. And fourthly, the poor." The term must tour is, I believe, a justifiable misnomer because, although Baba admittedly works with four classes of people, the predominant feature of almost every tour has been the contact of God-intoxicated souls. End of quote. These technical terms, hawa, seekers, salik-like pilgrims, etc., are described in detail in Chapter 1 of The Wayfarers. In an effort to stay on point here, we will simply recognize that this is Meher Baba's own classification system, which describes the position of individual souls in relation to their spiritual pursuits. Donkin does go into some detail on the nature of the work that Baba did with salik-like pilgrims, sadhus, and fakirs, and the poor. However, for this discussion, we will focus primarily on Baba's work with musts. In terms of what was outwardly visible, Baba's work with the musts was much like the work he did with the mad at the Rahuri ashram. As Donkin describes, Baba's work, his visible and external work, was to shave, bathe, clothe, and feed each inmate as soon as he arrived, and each day to scour the ashram latrine and to bathe and sit in seclusion with a number of the old inmates. In this way, he would throw every ounce of energy into doing every sort of menial task, and was, in fact, master of all and servant of all. End of quote. Meher Baba's purpose, it would seem, was to put each must in a relaxed, happy, and receptive mood. As Donkin explains, quote, "For some spiritual reasons of his own, Baba insists that the slightest whim of a must should be fulfilled." End of quote. Another quote, "On the evidence of Baba's own statement, we have learned that a must's moods have an important bearing on his usefulness for Baba's work." End of quote. And another quote, "Baba has stressed that he must fulfill the slightest whim of a must, and that if he fails to do this, the rapport is vitiated by an irritability on the part of the must, who feels his wish to have been frustrated. In this way, musts, like children, have the most inconsequent fancies and become upset if these are thwarted." End of quote. Well, why was this effort to please the must so important? Whatever Meher Baba's spiritual reason, it was abundantly evident to Dr. Donkin that a receptive mood on the part of a must seemed to release a great deal of joyful energy in Meher Baba. Dr. Donkin explains, quote, "Indeed, there is nothing that makes Baba so really happy as a first-rate must in a first-rate mood. When Baba is working with a good must, he becomes so engrossed that, for the time being, he utterly forgets his meals, his sleep, his clothes, his mandali, and, it seems, the whole wide world. The mandali, though they are glad to share these moments of manifest happiness, are often amazed at the relentless energy with which he pursues his work. At such times, Baba presses the throttle down hard to the floorboard without regard for the damage that he might do to the intricate machinery of his physical frame." End of quote. For the purpose of bringing about just such a happy state of affairs, Meher Baba and his mandali went through untold hardships and privations, traveling over 75,000 miles and making approximately 20,000 contacts during the years of 1940 through 1946. Many of us have read accounts of some of these difficult journeys or heard Erich and others speak of them. Beidel recalled to Donkin that on one tour in 1946, the party averaged a total of 14 hours of sleep over 8 straight days of work. Donkin also reports that, according to the Mandali who traveled with Baba, quote, throughout all these hardships, Baba remained the freshest of all, and after each contact with a really good must, he seemed particularly radiant, as if some great work had been achieved or some heavy burden lifted. End of quote. Whether in the must ashrams or on tour, the pace was often exhausting, requiring a constant vigilance that could, as Donkin describes, quote, produce a sense of stress and demand a power of adaptability not unlike that needed in war. One must be ready at any hour of the day or night to go into action at a word from Baba, or to change one's plans to meet a new situation. End of quote. All of these efforts and difficulties were undergone for the primary purpose of contacting a must. What then, we might well ask, did these contacts actually consist of? According to Donkin, quote, externally, Baba usually does three things when he contacts a must on tour. He feeds him, he gives him a metal coin, and he sits with him in a secluded place where no one sees this silent conference. Since observing silence, Baba has not touched money except when he gives it to musts, Salik-like pilgrims, sadhus, and the poor. This giving of money is fundamentally not charity, but is a medium of contact, and Baba, particularly with musts, uses metal coins. He has explained that the metal in some specific way acts as a medium of contact. Those who go on a must tour with Baba are often painfully aware of this necessity for metal coins, for their arms and fingers ache from carrying a heavy bag of coins of all denominations. End of quote. Well, this provides us with a rough outline of the external physical activities that Meher Baba engaged in when contacting a must. But why was this so important? What was the urgency behind these intense and often grueling activities? In the second discourse by Meher Baba at the beginning of Dr. Donkin's book, The Wayfarers, Meher Baba explains the state of mind of musts and how the master helps to relieve their suffering as well as regain a balance of spiritual perspective. Additionally, he explains that musts can be of great spiritual help to aspirants as well as to the master. In regard to helping aspirants, Meher Baba explains, quote, in spite of the fact that many musts lose their balance while traversing the path of the inner life, they are often capable of rendering effective service to other aspirants less advanced than themselves. Musts are completely oblivious of worldly considerations and values, but they are very sensitive to the spiritual needs of those who come in contact with them. Musts, because they are consciously stationed on the higher planes, can give to aspirants just that type of occult help that is necessary. End of quote. In regard to being of help to the master, Meher Baba says, quote, because of his being stationed on the inner planes, which are free from the limitations and handicaps of the gross world, a must can be, and often is, in contact with a far greater number of souls than is possible for an ordinary person. Must mind is a nucleus of conscious formations with innumerable and far-reaching links. A must can therefore be a more effective agent for spiritual work than the most able persons of the gross world. The must mind is also often used directly by the master as a medium for sending his spiritual help to different parts of the world. Very often, when the master is helping a must, he is also helping the world through him at that very time. When a must thus surrenders his mind for the work of the master, he is, in fact, getting closer to the master as truth. He is being perfected far more rapidly than would have been the case if he had avoided such surrender. End of quote. Without putting too fine a point on it, Donkin describes an example of what this might look like. In one instance, in July of 1940, one of the 5 favorite musts, Chatty Baba, who had no contact with the outside world and, as far as anyone knew, never read a newspaper, began repeatedly telling Krishna Nair that the people of Europe were suffering greatly. According to Donkin, one day Chatty Baba sat pouring earth over his head when he said, quote, that there would be much anguish and privation, and that many would die of starvation, but that Baba would finally assuage the suffering of the world, end of quote. Chatty Baba's distress seemed to reach a climax when, quote, on the night of 9 June 1940, Chatty Baba became suddenly violent, noisy, and abusive, and emerged in a state of disorder and frenzy from his little room. He went directly to Baba's room and declared that his house had now been utterly destroyed and that he had come for shelter to Baba. If that remark were literal, it made no sense at all, since his little room was, as it always had been, small and bare, but neat and whole, and a place where he was usually happy to sit alone for hours. Baba at once gave orders for the two to be left alone together, and Chatty Baba for some hours was heard chattering and expostulating with Baba. Eventually he became quiet and spent the rest of the night alone with Baba. End of quote. It was during this period that the German army overwhelmed the French military and took over the country of France. The Germans marched into Paris on June 13, 1940. Baba later explained that, due to Chatty Baba's connection with France, he had become distraught and agitated due to the extraordinary suffering that the French people were experiencing during this period. This anecdote seems to underline the following statement by Meher Baba in his discourses. Quote, those who have even a preliminary acquaintance with the structure and laws of the inner spheres of existence know that complete isolation of human beings is a figment of imagination. The gross world as a vehicle of spiritual life has its own indubitable importance, but the links and connections existing between different persons can by no means be fully estimated if we merely consider the tangible transactions which take place in the gross world. End of quote. Reflecting on Meher Baba's work with the Masts, it does not seem out of place to reflect on whether there is anything we have learned that we might generalize from this work to his work with individuals, groups, and humanity at large. Meher Baba's sister Mani makes a remark in David Fenster's book Mera Meher that I find interesting. Joking about the difficulties Meher Baba encountered when working with his female Western disciples, she said, Baba worked so many years with the men Mandali, so many years with the boys, so many years with the mad and musts, and then with the women. Oh, to have worked with the women. Baba didn't say so, but he implied, never again. Aside from the humorous nature of these comments, I was struck by how easily Mani correlated Baba's work with the mad and musts with so many other phases of his life's work. Although Meher Baba never went into much detail about the specifics of his work with Mera, with the Prem Ashram boys, with his Western disciples, etc., he does provide a surprising amount of detail about his work with the musts. In his comments to Donkin, recorded in The Wayfarers, he clearly describes the need to put the musts in a good mood in order to make them vehicles for his work. In his two discourses at the beginning of The Wayfarers, he describes several specific details on how he can use the musts for his work, especially when they are in a good mood. I found myself asking, what if this is how Baba worked with Mera, for example? He certainly would go out of his way to make her happy, often catering to her every wish, much in the same way that Donkin describes him doing with the musts. Mani often said that Mera represented the universe. Was Meher Baba using her as a medium for channeling his love to the world at large? The same questions might be asked in regard to his work with the boys in the Prem Ashram, the men Mandali, the Western disciples. One might also ask the same of the average follower of Meher Baba. We often hear people describe having experienced a honeymoon period with Meher Baba, where he seems to be giving the individual some special attention. Are these periods simply meant to prepare us for shouldering greater responsibilities in his work? Again, from the same discourse quoted above, Meher Baba says, "The unity and solidarity of the inner plane makes it possible for the Master to use his disciple as a medium for his work, even when the disciple is unconscious of serving this larger purpose of the Master. This is possible because the disciple, through his love and understanding of the Master, as well as his obedience and surrender, establishes a rapport with the Master and comes into tune with him. The Master feeds upon the love of his disciples and utilizes the spiritual forces released by them for his universal work. In this way, the Master is like the relaying station which receives a song only in order to broadcast it to the world at large. To love the Master is to love all, not merely symbolically, but actually. For what the Master receives on the subtle planes, he spiritualizes and distributes. Thus, he not only strengthens the personal links which the disciples may have with him, but also gives them the privilege of sharing his divine work." End of quote.